Hello and welcome to another podcast from Odell Technology. Today we're talking to the Secretary General, the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. Good morning, Doctor. How are you?
Good morning. I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Stephen. It's a great pleasure to be here to do this.
Good to see you again, sir. Dr. Natz, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and telling us about your professional background to this point in time.
With great pleasure. My name is Alexander Natz. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm running a trade organization based in Brussels. We represent 150 plus innovative pharma and biotech and medtech companies. We are watching legislation. We are actually in constant communication and discussions with the key EU stakeholders, including the European Commission, the Parliament, and Council, about ongoing legislative issues in Brussels. And I'm also working and practicing as a lawyer in Germany.
Perfect. I wondered if you'd like to tell us a bit about the organization, please.
We are, EUCOPE is a trade organization which sits in Brussels, which is 15 years old. We started very small. We're representing smaller to mid-sized innovative pharma and biotech companies. We actually keep them informed about ongoing legislative changes, not just in Brussels, but also at the EU member state level. So whenever there is change in legislation in countries such as Germany, France, but also beyond the EU, UK and other important territories, we keep them informed about it. And first and foremost, we're watching European legislation, how it develops, how it reacts to certain trends. And we are in constant discussion with those key decision makers in Brussels, as I said before.
So let's talk about the new regulations that have occurred in the last few years regarding Europe and pharmaceutical companies. How does that impact on your members right now?
I mean, there's huge impact, and when you travel to the US, that has been reaching the other side of the Atlantic, that we are currently revising our pharmaceutical legislation substantially when it comes to intellectual property rights. The European Commission has put on the table a draft legislation on the 26th of April this year. And that contains not just issues around supply chain, not just issues around how do we make our regulatory system fit for purpose, but it also concerns intellectual property rights, such as orphan exclusivity, regulatory data protection. And the Commission has chosen a way to generally decrease the duration of exclusivities for innovative pharma companies, and then potentially extend it to that level where we are today. So there are, and I think that's very important when you're in licensing or out licensing products, when you're developing your pipeline, there are significant changes at the horizon, very concrete, there's very concrete draft legislation, which could impact the time you have to recoup your investment on the basis of exclusivities for your medicines. There are many other things. We can talk about that later on, but I just wanted to allude to that, the most important and relevant thing. And the Commission has also put on the table a general concept, around unmet medical need and high unmet medical need, somewhat branding and grouping products into certain categories, which is so relevant for pharma and biotech companies to be fully aware of what's happening there. There are a couple of other trends. There's also a legislation which already passed, which is not draft legislation anymore, around the European Health Technology Assessment. Industry for a long time advocated in that direction to say, look, it's one product. Why don't we assess it all from the same angle, like we're doing it at the regulatory level with the European Medicines Agency and then the European Commission to make a decision for those medicines. So why don't we do the same when it comes to the clinical effectiveness of a medicine, what we call HTA in Europe? And there is legislation on the table which would enter into force for oncology indications and for cell and gene therapies on the 12th of January 2025. So that's a very important date for those companies to bring products to Europe, because that's the entry door into Europe when you have an oncology indication or a cell and gene therapy, and other products are to follow later on, like orphan drugs and all other centrally approved medicines and some medical devices from 2030 onwards at latest. So there is a lot happening these days in Brussels in terms of new legislation.
And obviously you keep your members up to date with the progress of these things and you represent your members at Brussels.
Exactly, that's what we're doing. We're being somewhat of a watchdog for them in Brussels. So we're watching out what's happening in legislation, but we're also talking, of course. So we're trying to be a good partner in Brussels, collaborate with other trade organizations, not just pharmaceutical associations. We are in constant discussions and many multi-stakeholder fora where we're discussing these changes with academics, with patients, with payers, and also with the European Medicines Agency ultimately, because that's where we are also a recognized stakeholder. We get invites to any meeting from the European Medicines Agency and also the European Commission. So we are somewhat in that, what we call the Brussels bubble. This is where we are active, and this is where we are actually having a lot of discussions, how we think as industry the legislation should be looking like for the years to come.
How do you think the new proposed legislation will affect pharmaceutical research in Europe?
It will have tremendous impact on research. We've been seeing quite recently, and that's positive, that finally the clinical trial regulation, which should help, and I think we can be optimistic about this, which should help to bring research in pharmaceuticals back to Europe, because we have a decreasing trend over the last decade of clinical trials to be not conducted in Europe, but in other parts of the world. So we're trying to revise that, and the clinical trial legislation will play a critical role in that respect. So that's an important piece of legislation, which is now up and running for 1.5 years almost. And we also hope that the HTA regulation will be could be part of making Europe more competitive at the end of the day. Because a one-stop shop is not bad to have, but we need to make sure that the way we're constructing our one-stop shop is really positive, and that companies can bring in the data into that new framework. So there are a lot of things happening, and this is how that's where we are active.
You talk about the one-stop shop HTA. How do pharma companies then negotiate with each country payer?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean the negotiation part is not part of the EU HTA. The EU HTA only concerns the clinical part of the health technology assessment. It does not contain the health economy part of the HTA, which some countries are conducting, others don't. So that remains in the national domain, and also the decision-making power about the HTA remains in the national domain. That was a political compromise at the end of the day, because countries didn't want to hand over budget control to Brussels when it comes to healthcare budgets. I mean, they wanted to safeguard that national budget when it comes to pharmaceutical spending. So the decision-making power is at the national level, but the dossier submission is at the EU level, and also the evaluation of what data is on the table, that is something the so-called coordination group will do. To your question, the national pricing and reimbursement negotiations will remain national and will not be handed over to Brussels at this stage. Although I must say there is a lot of discussion about joint procurement, joint negotiations, after what we have seen in the vaccines, that the Commission for the first time actually initiated a joint procurement, but that was under the pandemic, so that was a different situation as we're having it now.
Do you think one day we'll also see regional procurement for different sorts of drugs for rare diseases in Europe?
Well, we have seen a couple of initiatives which have been trying to go in that direction. Benelux, Finnois, the Nordic countries had this coalition. There's also a Valletta initiative. So there are a lot of companies grouping around the table, trying to negotiate jointly for certain medicines. And there's a lot of discussion about joint purchasing, joint procurement in Brussels. We think that we first need to get it right at the HTA level. It is really important that we are having a robust dossier and a robust foundation on what we can build pricing and reimbursement decisions on before we are going into joint purchasing and joint procurement exercises. Because the difference is really when it comes to the vaccines in the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the majority of the people were fully aware of the value of those type of vaccination. I mean, a lot of people wanted to have it. There was not so much an urgent need for an HTA, but for normal products, what you do is a health technology assessment. Before we're going to do something at the EU level around pricing, we need to make sure that we have a common understanding about the value of the medicine.
All right, no, that makes perfect sense, and I would tend to agree with you. Amongst your members, is anyone involved in the rare diseases at this point in time?
Well, a lot, to be honest, Stephen. I would think that more than half of our members are the majority of them are even only having more products in rare disease indications. So many of our members are in the field of rare diseases, and this is also why we are concerned about what the Commission is putting on the table when it comes to revising the legislation around orphan medicinal products. There are some trends which are, in a way, worrying, to group medicines into categories of unmet medical need, high unmet medical need. Yes. Because if you're not having that label of an unmet medical need product, you will have difficulties negotiating good prices at the member state level. That's a very big ticket to have or not to have. And this is what worries us. And when it comes to orphan medicinal products, the term to be used would be high unmet medical need, but the branding remains the same exercise. We do think that medicines for rare diseases shouldn't be branded with that term. And actually, we also think that it's very early on when we're making that judgment call at the level of the European Medicines Agency, which is at time of launch. We don't know everything about the medicine when it comes to launching a medicine in all the countries. We only learn a lot when the product is rolled out to the market, when a product gets access to a wider patient population. And I think we just think that that judgment call is coming in way too early, and that could have potential negative effects also on companies bringing products to Europe.
I'm pleased to hear you say that. Tell me, with the new regulations that are in place, patient-reported outcomes, and talking to the community or the patient groups, how does your organization engage with patient groups?
We have a lot of interaction with patients group at various levels. First and foremost, in the field of rare diseases, we are in many multi-stakeholder fora where trade organizations, or better to say, patient organizations like Eurotas and many other patient organizations are around the table. It's really increasingly important that we are having that constant discussion. And it's really a very positive trend that when you look at the EU HTA, it is not a discussion anymore that patients are around the table. That was probably different 10 to 15 years ago. That's probably different in many countries where it's not given that patients have a voice when it comes to the decision-making about medicines at the regulatory, but also at the pricing and reimbursement level. I think a lot has changed over the last 10 years, and I think it's very positive that the Commission has been taking that into account and gave patients a bigger voice when it comes to the EU HTA. That's a very positive trend.
I'm starting to see more registries associated with rare diseases.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, Stephen, I think it's really important that we're factoring in the real world, that we're factoring in outcomes which only occur, which we only see when the product is in the market, when the product is outside of the clinical trial setting, when the product has an approval by the European Commission. Only then there's so much we see, we learn about that medicine, also in terms of, is it better than what we're having? So we should really move away from that. Okay, we make a decision when the product is launched into European markets, and then we're only doing pharmacovigilance. No, that was the past approach. The new approach should be giving it an approval and later on being open for always adapting to the needs of the patients, gathering registry data, and so on. We need to make sure, though, that we're not ending up with 27 registries in all the different countries, because we are overburdening companies at the end of the day. But registries play an incredible role in the future of value-based pricing, in the future of maintaining products in the market. So we should put more emphasis. We have multi-stakeholder fora like real-world evidence for decisions where we're advocating in that direction.
That's interesting. Dr. Natz, you've almost alluded to what you'd like to see in a perfect world. So could I ask you, assuming you could run the European Medicines Agencies and you could run HTAs, what would you like to see in a perfect world?
In a perfect world, to be honest, when it comes to the European Medicines Agency, we're fine-tuning our regulatory system. And I think there are a lot of interesting proposals on the table. I must say that the European Commission, in a rather positive way, has been trying to factoring the lessons learned from the pandemic. So we're looking into extending the rolling review beyond what we've seen in the vaccines. We've seen those products reaching European patients almost as quickly as in the US. So that's very good. We're competitive at the regulatory level. They are developing a regulatory sandbox, which is another very positive thing to look into. We are considering using vouchers for IP rates. So at that level, you mentioned the European Medicines Agency. I think we have a robust system in Europe, and that's very positive, and that's the first step. At the HTA level, I think we have a patchwork of practices, and I think in an ideal scenario, we would have a one-stop shop with the EU HTA, with a coordination group in the center of it, which would actually work, which would factor in the particularities of the individual products, which would factor in the fact that an ATMP is a one-time treatment and very often is taking place in or is having an indication which is rare or ultra rare. We need to make sure that this is factored in. So in an ideal scenario, that system is a learning system. That system is a flexible system, which is not for closing its eyes after a decision has been made. We need to learn with real-world evidence. And we need to have a robust methodology which looks into all the particularities of the individual medicine, be it a rare disease medicine, an orphan drug, or be it a cell and gene therapy or a vaccine treatment. So that is really important, that it's a learning system and that we are factoring in the specifics of certain types of medicines.
It almost needs to be a reflection of itself. It needs to go back and look at what it's done in the past. Right. And keep on reflecting upon the outcomes.
Right. And always having in the back of our mind that we need to make sure that innovation comes to Europe in an ideal scenario first. This is a competitive world we're living in, and companies watch very carefully how markets are developing. And it's so important that we keep that robust competitive system, that we're fine-tuning it, that we're adapting it to changes to developments. For example, platform approaches, as we've seen partly used in the mRNA vaccines, need to be further developed. Innovative payment models like outcome-based agreements, which factor in certain guarantees the company is giving to payers and healthcare systems to make sure that what those patients and what those healthcare system would get is value for money, and that actually that one-time treatment is actually working in individual patients. And ultimately, real-world evidence, as you alluded to, is a very important ingredient in that respect.
I would agree with you that there's a great opportunity to do interesting, innovative payment methods. There are a number that are available right now in a number of European countries. Have you got anything in mind that you've seen that would be perhaps the best way forward with some innovative payment methods?
Yeah, I mean, that is really something we are discussing for many years in conferences and so on. And honestly, I think, and I'm a lawyer by training, I would say like, keep it simple is really important for both sides of the negotiation table. When you're overloading such outcome-based agreements or risk sharing schemes, you get lost in details and so on. It is always important that when you're defining success, and this is what you're doing in an outcome-based agreement, it needs to be measurable, and you need to have access to the data to measure success. And this is why in so many of those conferences there were always these people which were saying like, that's never going to fly, that's never going to work. But we've seen it working, as you've been saying, Stephen, and it has been working in France, has been working in Germany, but it always needs to start with a discussion about what is success and how can we measure it, and how can we make sure that both sides of the table can see the result. Because you don't want to have a payback scheme as a company which you can't measure in a way, and sometimes data privacy is in the way, but sometimes there are ways to make it possible. And clear endpoints are an important ingredient in that respect. measurable endpoints, which you probably can see. For example, you could see in the hospital data, which then the payer has access to say like a certain surgery has been done, which is if that surgery has been done, we're saying that the patient that the treatment has not been successful. Survival, of course, could be an endpoint because we can measure survival in individual patients. And keep it simple is my advice in that respect.
That's interesting. I've known a number of pharmaceutical companies who've had lawyers involved, and it's wherever they've gotten skilled lawyers, it's always worked. It's always worked. So no,
Yeah.
well, I think the next thing I'd like to do is just to talk a bit more about your organization before we finish today. If you would like to describe, I know you've described briefly what you do for your members and how you go about it, but I think that what you do is quite wonderful for SMEs. I'm a big supporter of SMEs because I've been working with them for many years. If I'm a group of PhDs and I'm sitting in Erasmus and I've come up with a rather clever program or project, then how do I approach someone like you about membership and what are the benefits of it?
Yeah, I mean, what we always try to do is staying, even though we have been getting bigger. We started with 7 companies in 2008, but we always try to be lean in a way. We try to be open-minded. We try to be service provider oriented, or being a service provider at the end of the day. I don't want to over promote this, but we always have also said from the beginning that we want to take a look at the member state level, what's happening in important countries like Spain, Italy, France, Germany, the Nordic countries, the Eastern European countries, what's happening there, because access is all about the member state level. And this is really where I think that was important, because companies are really, they really want to get a picture about what's happening in Europe, not just the regulatory trends, which I talked about, like what's happening at the EMA level, very important, no doubt. And I think we have seen some positive trends there, but also what is happening at the access level, at the member state level, and in those decision-making processes. And yeah, being hands-on, really listening also to the company's needs. I mean, very often in Brussels, we tend to talk a bit too much into our Brussels bubble, like we all tend to do if we're in a certain fora. But to go outside that bubble a little bit and listen to CEOs, listen to market access people, yeah. What are their concerns? I think that has been a growth factor in the organization. And we've been going where innovation is. There have been a lot of companies from the world which have been part of the organization. We have 150 members. So please come approach us, send us an email. As I said, it's a hands-on organization, and email is good enough. And we're jumping on a call next week to discuss what the pros and cons are.
You are an open source, and I thank you very much for your time today. It's been great to talk to you and see you. And I hope we can do this again very soon about some of the success stories for the future. Thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Let's continue that discussion. Thank you.